Welcome to Course 3, Unit 1. In this unit, you'll find out about the stages involved in developing an ISO international standard. Before diving into this course, make sure you're clear on the topics that were covered in Course 1, the basics, and Course 2, who develops international standards. This slide shows the traditional process that is followed when developing an international standard. As the document progresses towards the publication stage, the threshold for consensus increases, and this is what makes the ISO process so robust. Each stage is reviewed in more detail throughout this module. If you would like to see a matrix presentation of the various project stages, see the ISO IEC Directives Part 1, Annex F. The preliminary stage is optional. It allows committees to register work items that aren't sufficiently mature to go to further stages, and for which target dates can't yet be set. This stage can be useful for developing an initial draft for a new work item proposal. If a project does not progress beyond this stage within 3 years, it will be automatically cancelled. This stage is used to propose a new standard, or a new part of an existing standard. This stage is also used for proposing a technical specification or a publicly available specification. New projects can be proposed by various stakeholders, such as a national body, a Category A liaison organisation, or the Secretariat of the Committee. The proposer must fill in Form 4, and they must fully justify the market need for the standard. Acceptance requires a 2/3 majority of P members voting, and a commitment to actively participate from at least 5 P members, or 4 if there are fewer than 16 P members in the committee. Once accepted, a new project is registered in the programme of work and the target dates are set. The nominated experts then start working on the document, which is now called a working draft, either within an existing working group or by creating a new one specifically for this project. This is called the preparatory stage and culminates with a final working draft that can be approved and registered as a committee draft. When a draft reaches the committee draft stage, it is the first time that it goes outside the working group. The draft undergoes extra scrutiny by being circulated to the national standards bodies who are members of the committee. Remember though that this stage is optional and can be skipped if certain conditions are met, as described in Annex SS of the Directives Part 1. The committee draft is balloted, usually for 8 weeks. The Secretariat then compiles the comments and circulates them to all P and O members, along with a proposal for how to proceed. This can be either to discuss the CD at the next meeting, to circulate a revised draft, or, if sufficient consensus has been reached, to register the CD for the inquiry stage. The resolution of comments usually needs the working group experts to meet and discuss. The inquiry stage is a real test of the draft's viability as an international standard, as this is when it is scrutinised by all national bodies during a 12-week vote. Approval requires 2/3 of the votes cast by P members of the committee to be in favour, and not more than 1/4 of the total number of votes cast to be negative. And negative votes must be accompanied by technical reasons or they will not be counted. Depending on the results of the ballot, the chair, in conjunction with the Secretariat and the project leader, has several options. If the draft was approved with no technical changes, then it can go straight to publication at this stage. If it was approved, but there are technical changes that need to be incorporated, then the draft progresses to the approval stage, which we will look at in just a minute. If the vote fails and the approval criteria are not met, Then they can either circulate a revised draft for another DIS vote, circulate it as a committee draft for commenting, or discuss it at the next meeting. A draft submitted for approval stage is now called a final draft international standard. The voting period is 8 weeks, and the approval criteria are the same as for the DIS, i.e. 2/3 majority of P members in favour and not more than a quarter of the votes negative. If the FDIS is approved, the draft proceeds to publication. And remember that no technical changes can be made at this point. Only editorial errors can be corrected before publication. Technical comments made at this stage can be considered at the next revision of the standard. If the FDIS is not approved, it must go back to the committee so that they can consider the technical reasons for the failure of the vote. Either they can submit a modified draft at the committee, inquiry or approval stage. They can publish a technical specification or a publicly available specification, as those deliverables require a lower level of consensus. You can see Course 1, Unit 4 for more information on that. Or they can cancel the project. Hopefully the document will pass the ballot and make it to publication stage. This is the stage when ISO CS corrects any errors indicated by the committee secretariat and publishes the final document. Here is a reminder of all the different stages and the corresponding documents. So we started with the preliminary work item. That became a new work item proposal, which was approved to become a working draft. The draft was then circulated as a committee draft before becoming a draft international standard. It then progressed to a final draft international standard before being published as an international standard. Remember that not all of these stages are compulsory. We will explain more about which stages can be skipped in Course 3, Unit 3. Thank you. Welcome to Course 3, Unit 2. In the previous unit, we introduced all the different development stages of an international standard. In this unit, you will find out why we need to go through these different stages. Before going further, make sure you understand the development stages we talked about in Course 3, Unit 1. It might seem as though there are many stages and lots of obstacles to overcome in order to publish an international standard. So why do we need all these different stages? The answer is to build consensus on a working document. You may remember from Course 1, Unit 3, that consensus is a key principle on which standardization is built. ISO defines it as a general agreement characterized by the absence of sustained opposition to substantial issues by any important part of the concerned interests, and by a process that involves seeking to take into account the views of all parties concerned and to reconcile any conflicting arguments. To recap from the development stages that we introduced in the previous unit, remember that a project starts at the preliminary stage with a preliminary work item and ends in the publication of an international standard. Consensus is built throughout the process when the draft is submitted for approval to different levels of membership, from experts in the working group through to all national bodies. The preliminary work item and the new work item proposal are considered and voted on by national member bodies who are members of the committee. This is when it is determined whether a project is globally relevant, whether the market needs it, and if there are sufficient experts who will commit to working on it. Without these important initial stages, the project would not progress any further. The project is then in the hands of the experts who work on the draft. when consensus is reached between the experts, the document progresses to the committee stage. At the committee stage, it is once again the committee members who vote on the draft on behalf of their national mirror committees. The ballots for the draft and the final draft international standard are open to all ISO members, so not only the national bodies who are members of the committee developing the standard. Lastly, the publication stage is not a voting stage. This is when the ISO Central Secretariat will correct any typographical errors or make small editorial changes and finally process the document for publication. If we look at the level of consensus at each stage, we see that the working group experts have found the draft to be mature enough to withstand scrutiny at the next stage. Then the national bodies pass the document at CD stage for an even higher level of consensus. The ISO members then approve the document at DIS and FDIS stages, resulting in publication as a result of a system of steadily increasing consensus. If at any stage consensus is not reached, then the draft must go back for revision before it can be resubmitted. This slide shows nicely the different stages with the growing consensus at different levels of membership. At each stage, depending on the voting results and the comments received, it is the working group experts who amend the draft so that it can be resubmitted. Welcome to Course 3, Unit 3. In the previous 2 units, we introduced all the different development stages of an international standard and the levels of consensus that need to be reached for that document to be published. In this unit, I'll tell you which stages are mandatory and which can be skipped, and you'll get an idea of how long it takes to publish an international standard. Before going further, make sure you understand the development stages and how we build consensus from the previous 2 units. So you may have been thinking that there are a lot of steps in the development of an ISO standard, and whether we really need them all. The answer is no. In some cases, not all the stages are required. This slide shows all the stages of development. The stages in black can, in some cases, be skipped, while the red ones are mandatory. For instance, all projects need to be proposed and accepted, so the new work item proposal is in red. Likewise, the draft international standard is red because it represents a high level of consensus being reached and can never be missed. The final draft international standard is coloured red because it's mandatory if there are technical changes resulting from the DIS ballot. If there are only editorial changes following the DIS ballot, then it can be published without going through an FDIS ballot. At the beginning of your project, you would have made a project plan based on the overall development track of the project. This includes target dates, the most important of which are the DIS ballot and the FDIS ballot, if you need to have one. If you miss these targets, many stakeholders will be questioning why the document is not being balloted yet, and it might also create potential problems for processing within ISO Central Secretariat, and even affect the scheduling of any promotional activities that are planned for the project. As well as the vital target dates shown in red, it's always good practice to also set target dates for earlier stages. This helps you to keep the project on track to ensure those later targets and the eventual publication date can be met. Just so you don't forget, this shows again the stages where it is important to have a defined project plan in place so you can make sure the project stays on track. We've been through all the stages of developing an ISO standard, And it seems like this must take a really long time, right? Well, in some cases it does. But in other cases, it can be very quick, particularly when the committee exercises good project management. Let's start at the beginning with the preliminary stage. As you know, this is optional and is a mechanism for getting a project listed in the work programme, so that an initial draft can be developed. It is allowed to stay at this stage for up to 3 years, after which time it will be automatically cancelled if nothing is done with it. If the committee does proceed with the project, and it is approved at the new project ballot, this is when the development track of 18, 24, 36 or 48 months is set, and the clock starts counting down to that eventual publication date. Always keep in mind that with careful planning and good time management, some stages can be skipped, so your project can get to the finish line faster. In the next unit, we will look in a bit more detail at what actually happens at each step. Welcome to Course 3, Unit 4. In the previous 3 units, we introduced all the different development stages of an international standard, the levels of consensus that need to be reached for the document to be published, and the stages that can be skipped. In this unit, we will look in a bit more detail at who does what at every stage. Before going further, make sure you understand the development stages, how we build consensus, and what conditions allow us to skip stages from the previous 3 units. So what actually happens at every stage of development? If you remember, these are the 7 stages, starting with the preliminary work item right through to the final published standard. To make it easier to remember, we will be using some recognisable symbols on the following slides. The cogs denote general information and characteristics about a particular step. The upwards facing arrow means something that happens before the ballot. The ballot box is for the actual ballot, and the downward facing arrow is something that happens after the ballot or as a result of the ballot. Let's start at the beginning with the preliminary stage. Remember that this is one of the optional stages that can be skipped. Usually it's used to work on proposals which are not yet sufficiently mature for going to a further stage. For instance, it might be to do with an emerging technology or something where there are not yet enough experts committed to working on it. It is often an ad hoc group that would work on a preliminary work item, rather than a working group, who instead dedicate their time to working on projects that have been approved and have target dates. The preliminary work item doesn't yet have any target dates, although there may be unofficial dates which are not yet registered in the system. The committee has 3 years to move to a new work item proposal, or else the project gets automatically cancelled. While not all new work item proposals include a draft with the ballot, it's most helpful to have one if possible. The preliminary stage is when this draft would be developed. But there should be no detailed work done on the draft at this stage, as the work could be wasted if the new work item proposal is rejected. There is no ballot needed to move on to the proposal stage. This is one of the mandatory stages, and it's the first time that the project will be scrutinised by committee members as to its global and market relevance. A new work item proposal applies to all new standards. Revisions don't have to go through the proposal stage unless there is a change to the scope from the previous edition. It also applies to new parts of multi-part standards, publicly available specifications, and technical specifications. The project is presented using Form 4, which includes details such as the scope of the project, justification for its development, and the type of deliverable. Most often, new work item proposals are introduced by a national body, but they can also be initiated by the Secretariat of the Committee, a Category A liaison, the Technical Management Board, or the ISO Central Secretariat Secretary General. At this stage, the proposer should make every effort to include a draft for discussion, or at least an outline of the document. They should also nominate a project leader and provide a project plan with target date. The Secretariat can request clarifications if necessary, but they cannot refuse a new work item proposal. The Secretariat is responsible for filling out the Form 4 in conjunction with the proposer, and they initiate the ballot. New work items cannot be approved by a show of hands at a meeting. The decision has to be made by a committee ballot, which is usually 12 weeks. Approval requires 2/3 majority of the P members voting, and there must be a commitment to participate from 5 P members, or it can be 4 P members if there are fewer than 16 P members in the committee. Abstentions are not counted, and any negative vote must be properly justified. If the experts are not named by national bodies when voting, this can result in the project not starting. After the ballot, the Secretary has the responsibility of circulating the voting results and completing the administrative post-voting decision process within 1 month. If it is approved, then the project will be registered in the committee's programme of work and the clock starts ticking. The preparatory stage is optional. As we've seen, it might be that there is already a draft that is mature enough to proceed straight to a later stage without further discussion in a working group. If you do decide to go through the preparatory stage, the project will either be assigned to an existing working group or there will be a new working group set up specifically to work on this project. Whichever is the case, that working group should have a meeting scheduled soon after the new project has been approved. This first meeting needs to be planned already when the project proposal is submitted. While keeping to the agreed target date, the working group then works on the draft, which may undergo several revisions before consensus is achieved, and it can be submitted to the committee draft stage. There is no ballot during the preparatory stage. Instead, the working group can launch consultations among experts. This is not like a vote with a yes or no answer. It's more like a discussion. The committee stage is optional, but in many cases, it is a key stage of consensus building when comments from national bodies are considered. Skipping the committee stage requires a 1-month ballot, or it needs to be agreed during a plenary meeting. Before the ballot, the committee stage starts with the working draft being submitted for registration as a committee draft. Then, the Secretariat of the committee launches the ballot for all the committee's members. That means P members, O members, and liaisons. The duration is 8 weeks by default, although this can be extended to 12 or 16 weeks if necessary. For example, some bodies might want a longer period to consult with their national mirror committees. Then the national bodies provide comments, both technical and editorial, and indicate whether they agree to move to DIS. After the ballot has ended, the Secretary then compiles all the comments and the committee leadership decides on the next step, which might be to discuss the committee draft at another meeting, revise the committee draft for another ballot, or register it for the DIS ballot. It's the responsibility of the project leader to show how the comments have been resolved and to prepare a new draft for the next stage. As you know by now, the inquiry stage is mandatory. This is the principal stage when all ISO members get to vote on the draft to approve publication or not, and to submit their comments for consideration. This is the last stage at which technical comments can be considered. The committee submits their approved committee draft for registration as a draft international standard. Whereas previous ballots have been ballots internal to the committee and launched by the Secretary, at this stage, the Secretariat must submit the draft and its accompanying documents to ISO Central Secretariat, who then initiate the DIS ballot that will go to all ISO members. After an 8-week translation period, the DIS ballot can start for a duration of 12 weeks. The acceptance criteria are a 2/3 majority of voting P members and no more than a quarter of all the votes cast to be negative. Negative votes must be justified by technical reasons, or else they are not counted. ISO Central Secretariat edits the document during the DIS ballot so that it will be in good shape for publication after the ballot, and so that any serious concerns can be picked up before the final stages. After the ballot closes, the Secretariat has a limit of 12 weeks to circulate the report of voting. The document will go straight to publication if the approval criteria are met and there are no technical changes to be made. If the criteria are met, but technical changes must be incorporated, then the draft will be modified accordingly and then registered at the approval stage as a final draft international standard. If the document is not approved, then the committee leadership can either circulate a revised DIS for another ballot, they could go back to the committee draft stage for another ballot, or wait to discuss the ballot results and the comments at the next meeting. The inquiry stage ends with registration of the text for circulation as an FDIS, or for publication. The approval stage is mandatory unless the DIS was approved without technical comments. The FDIS ballot is a yes or no vote for publication, and it's the last stage at which ISO members vote on the draft. Only editorial changes can be made at this late stage. No technical comments will be considered. So, before the vote, committees submit their drafts for registration as an FDIS. The Secretariat then submits the draft to ISO Central Secretariat, who will then initiate the ballot. The ballot lasts for 8 weeks, during which time ISO Central Secretariat will check the document again. As before, the approval criteria are 2/3 majority of voting P members and no more than a quarter of all votes cast to be negative. Technical comments cannot be incorporated at this stage, so will be kept for consideration at the next revision of the document. If the draft is approved, then it goes to publication. If not, then the committee can resubmit the draft as a committee draft, a draft international standard, or another final draft international standard. Or they can publish it as a technical specification or a publicly available specification, both of which require lower levels of consensus. Or they can cancel the project entirely. The publication stage is when ISO corrects any editorial errors that were spotted during the FDIS. It then goes to the committee for a final proof before being published. Welcome to Course 3, Unit 5. In the previous units, we went over the stages of development of an international standard. In this unit, we will look at how published standards are maintained and kept up to date. You may want to look back at Course 2 to remind yourself who develops international standards. ISO standards respond to a need, but needs can change. So that need must be assessed over time to ensure that ISO standards all remain relevant. So how do we ensure this? If a standard needs updating, we can publish a revision or a minor revision. A minor revision does not impact the technical content, and it goes through a much quicker publication procedure. Alternatively, if just a small part of the technical content needs updating, we can publish an amendment. A corrected version is only to correct errors or ambiguities that were not spotted before publication, so this does not really apply to keeping the document up to date. Even if no updates have been identified, all documents are subject to systematic review, which we will look at in more detail a bit later. So first, let's look at revisions and minor revisions. A revision is initiated for an update or a change to the technical content of an existing standard. If the scope is unchanged, it can be initiated by a simple resolution rather than going through a new work item proposal. Other than that, it will follow the same development procedure as we've covered in the first 4 units of this course. A minor revision is only for editorial changes, which must be briefly described in the foreword. It cannot impact the technical content. The procedure is greatly simplified. It goes straight to the approval stage. The secretary of the committee can access the revisable files of the existing standards so that they can update the draft and submit it to ISO Central Secretariat. Amendments are used for changing or making additions to the technical content of published standards. They can be initiated by a committee resolution as long as there is no change to the scope of the document. Like a revision, the development procedure is the same as for a standard. But you can't keep amending standards forever. Amendments are published as separate documents to be used alongside the existing parent standard. So any more than 2 amendments would make the original document quite hard to use. If you have a document that needs to be amended a 3rd time, then you would instead initiate a revision. Finally, there is a tool that ensures that all international standards remain relevant: the systematic review. This happens automatically 5 years after publication, and the review period lasts for 20 weeks. The result is decided by a simple majority of the P members. They can choose whether they think the standard should be confirmed, meaning it will remain available and unchanged for another 5 years. The second option is to revise the standard, which can be initiated without the need for a new work item proposal. Or finally, if the standard is not used in 5 countries or more, it is not deemed to be globally relevant, so they can vote for withdrawal. This shows the importance of making sure that standards remain relevant to their market. Based on the results of the systematic review ballot, the committee secretary proposes the action to take, that is, to confirm, revise or withdraw.